Hello, my name is Stewart Williamson, and I'm a graduate of University of North Texas, where I completed a bachelor's degree in biology and an undergraduate honors thesis. After graduating, I continued my education doing graduate level courses where I became familiar with R and SPSS and completed a GIS project. While continuing my education, I was a lab instructor for biology and chemistry labs where I would help facilitate the application of class material beyond textbooks and PowerPoint slides. After my academic career, I became a quality control lab supervisor in a manufacturing lab where teaching and training was my initial focus, but then transitioned into data analysis. From calculating experimental test results for customer review, monitoring the accuracy and precision performances of my lab technicians, and then participating in Lean Six Sigma projects to promote better manufacturing practices. From this experience, I'd observed that data was everywhere, and I developed the desire to better track it, organize it, analyze, and make data driven decisions with it. Currently, I am completing a Savvy Coders Data Analytics and Python bootcamp to further my data analysis skills while becoming IC Agile certified and completing a Capstone project. During the bootcamp, I performed a product manager task ensuring that everyone in my group, including myself, was meeting deadlines and completing our homework, making progress in our job searches, and our own individual capstone projects. As a former educator, I was concerned about the success of my students, not necessarily only for my class, but for their overall college career. For my capstone project, I focused on finding patterns from before a student starts college that relates to them successfully graduating or dropping out, to then further help identify which students may struggle more in the beginning of their college career and then be able to help advise and support their goals in graduating. So my question is there a correlation between parent education level and student academic success? And is there a difference between male and female students? The purpose of this project is to identify struggling groups of students based on their parent education levels and to help promote support to such groups to decrease dropout rates. This analysis would be of interest of three groups of people. One, the students and their parents to help identify themselves. Two, the academic advisors to help identify and advocate for the students. And three, universities to offer more support to where it is needed and pinpoint where and what needs to be funded. Then, as a result, universities will have a higher graduation rate and retention rate, which would mean they would receive more tuition money. Some notes about the dataset that I will be using is that the dataset contains the education level of each parent independently, while other datasets that I found only included the parent with a higher education level. However, a con about the dataset is it is exclusively only has university data from Portugal. Although I believe having the separate education levels of each parent could reveal another perspective that couldn't be found with other datasets, so I continued with this dataset. Once I viewed the dataset in Excel, I had selected the columns of interest and created another Excel file, so it would be easier to work with. Before I moved on, I noticed that my data was for gender, father education, and mother education were all in numerical values, such as gender was in zeros and ones instead of male and female. After finding what the meaning of the numerical values were from the original data source, I went into VS Code and used Python accompanied by the pandas and numpy libraries to where I would be able to access the dataset, use for loops to iterate through each column, and use conditionals to convert each numerical value into a categorical value. I added each value into empty arrays to create new columns, which I converted into series and added all back into a new data frame and exported the newly created dataset. Originally, the education levels of each parent had over 37 different numerical values. However, I converted them into three different categorical values of primary education, secondary education, and trade school education. Primary education will refer to a high school diploma or anything less, as secondary education will refer to a completed bachelor's degree or higher, and a trade school education is anything that's higher than a primary education that isn't a degree and is focused on a course that is required for a job and not technically from a college or university. After cleaning my dataset, I performed an exploratory data analysis in VS Code through Python using matplotlib library. to make sure that the dataset will be able to answer my project question. The first question I asked, was there enough students that graduated and dropped out? Then I checked to make sure that the dataset had large enough sample sizes of both students graduating and dropping out. And after looking at the bar chart, I concluded that there was a good amount of representation for both. I previously had an interest of other questions about the correlation between the amount of credits a student enrolls in their first semester and whether or not they would graduate or drop out. However, I found that 81% of all students enrolled in between 5 to 7 credits in their first semester, which wouldn't create a great comparative analysis as it created a very skewed data set. Although, I then asked, how was the distribution of students by mother education and academic outcome? And I found that each sample size of each group were large enough to create dropout rates with less bias and variance. After dropping the currently enrolled students from my dataset, I went into DB Browser and used SQL to create tables with totals of dropout counts and graduate counts. And I then imported that new created table back into DB Browser and added a dropout rate column, which was the value I would be using to create my graphs in Tableau. In my first graph, I'm comparing student dropout rates with individual parent education levels. Groups to focus on include the two lowest dropout rates of students when their father only has a primary education, as seen in the orange bar, and when their mother had a secondary education, as seen in the red bar in group 2. The lower dropout rate when the father only had a primary education compared to a student with a father that had a secondary education was unexpected but interesting, and we'll keep an eye on it in future graphs. Another group to focus on is the group with the highest dropout rate, which was from the students with a mother that only had a primary education. In the second graph, we're comparing the dropout rates while coupling the parents. We still see the dropout rate of group of students with the father having a primary education is lower than most of the other ones, as you can see in group 1. And when paired with the mother having a secondary education, it becomes the lowest dropout rate. Then looking at the dropout rates of students with their mother having a secondary education, as indicated in all the orange bars, they tend to be lower than other student groups, with the exception when it's paired with the father who has a secondary education. As well, the students with the mother having only a primary education, as seen as the blue bars, have higher dropout rates compared to all other groups, no matter the education level of the father. After looking at students as a collective, we'll now focus on comparing male and female students, but in this graph, we're also only focusing on the father's education. However, the first thing we want to look at is the overall dropout rates compared to from male to female students. As you can see that male students have a 56% dropout rate, while females only had around 30% dropout rate, which is nearly half of the male dropout rate. But when comparing about the father's education level, we see that with the primary education level is still lower than any other education level on the father's side. But when looking at the secondary education level, especially for male students, they seem to be more affected and have a higher dropout rate level compared to females. Now looking at male and female students and their mother's education level, we still see the highest dropout rate by students with mothers that only have a primary education with the orange bar, and the lowest dropout rate of students with having a mother that has a secondary education, as you can see with the red bars, which appears to be consistent between both male and female students and previous graphs. In this final graph, where the parents' educations are coupled for each student and separated by student gender, we created 18 separate student groups. For both male and female students, even after being paired with the father's education level or different education levels, Students who have a mother that only has a primary education level often have the highest dropout rates among the other students, as you can see in the first group here. Then the group with the sum of the lowest dropout rates are from students with mothers that have a secondary education level, as you can see in the second group. Although there is an exception when the mother is coupled with a father that also has a secondary education, which has this huge spike in the middle of the middle group. Again, all parent students with a father having only a primary education and mother with a secondary education, you get the lowest dropout rates among all other students. And students who have the mother that had a primary education and a father with either a secondary education or trade school education, you get the highest dropout rates regardless of the student's gender. I then performed a chi-square test to validate that there was a statistical difference between groups and they weren't just simply by chance. The p-value that I calculated for overall male and female dropout rates were very close to 0.05, but was slightly larger. So technically stating that there is a probability that the amount of dropouts were by chance and are independent of each other. In other words, there's just not enough evidence that there is a relationship between gender and academic outcome. However, when calculating p-values for parent education level, whether if I'm only focusing on the father education levels independently, the mothers independently, or combined, all calculated p-values were less than 0.01, suggesting that there is a relationship between the parent education level and the student academic outcome. Some takeaways that I have are that both students that have a mother with a secondary education are more likely to graduate. And oddly enough, both students, but especially male students, were more likely to drop out if their father had a secondary education or a trade school education. And some of the recommendations that I would include are doing a focused study on determining why male students are almost twice as likely to drop out compared to female students. Even though there's still some probability of the amount of dropouts by both male and female students could have been by chance, I still recommend conducting this test, but I also recommend adding a cause of dropout column that may give more insight for the data. I would also suggest offering more support to struggling groups of students, especially students with mothers that only have a primary education, in the form of more tutoring or scholarship funding, granted that it is earned. And then I would strongly advise students to accept the advice to seek out the support, because as much as the university can offer more and more to students, it doesn't do anything unless the students act on it. Thank you for watching my capstone project. Again, my name is Stewart Williamson, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.